Good afternoon, everybody. We're so very excited to be presenting 3 of IEEE's standards projects in the P7000 series. And what I'm going to do now, we have John Havens on the line. He is the Executive Director of the IEEE Global Initiative on Ethics of Autonomous and Intelligent Systems. And John's going to provide a brief overview of the initiative and how it inspired some of these standards.
Awesome. Thank you, Justin, and to David, and thanks to everyone. Really honored to be here. And per what Justin said, back in 2015, the IEEE Standards Association created the IEEE Global Initiative, as Justin just mentioned it, and that's the shorthand, the IEEE Global Initiative. And there were 2 primary goals for the initiative. One was to create a paper called Ethically Aligned Design, and we've actually posted 2 versions of that paper. They're available for free to the public as Creative Commons documents. And the logic of those, version 2, for instance, features 13 committees, about 250 global experts worked to create it, and they identified key issues that are of top of mind to experts in the space right now, and they're in areas of like law and personal data, autonomous weapons. And the goal of that paper was to say, let's get 15 experts in each of these different groups to list the top 5 or 10 or however many issues per each section, so that other people working in the space could have some best-in-class thinking. And then also they were released as requests for input documents. So we wanted to make the point, A, the document is in draft form because it's so important, we wanted to get it up and out to the general public. And secondly, because we wanted feedback, we were very clearly stating these are not the only recommendations, these are what we call candidate recommendations, but we did want to give pragmatic next steps advice on how to actually build autonomous and intelligent systems, prioritizing ethical considerations at the front end of design. So what happened was another key focus of the creation of the group, and the credit for this really certainly goes to Konstantinos Karahalios, who is the IEEE Standards Association Managing Director, both for the idea for the paper and for the standards working groups, 3 of which we're talking about today. The logic of ethically aligned design, or more accurately, the members of the initiative, the volunteers, in any of the working groups, the committees creating the paper ethically aligned design, there would oftentimes then be either an individual or a group, a committee would say, it looks like we really need to have a standard focused on X, the logic being that there's enough recognition that a certain technology was ready to sort of create a standards working group. And so in that case, for a number of the P7000 standards, members of the initiative would then actually go to the IEEE Standards Association and create what's called a PAR and apply to have that then become a working group. So the initiative is separate from the Standards Association. It's a program of the Standards Association, but just to be crystal clear, the initiative doesn't make standards. That's up to the SA. And also, once a standards project becomes approved, like the projects we're talking about today, it's not a standard, and it takes about 2 or 3 years for it to be created and happen. So also want to be clear, too, that not all of the P7000 standards were directly inspired by ethically aligned design, but when they are in the P7000 series, the logic is that they are both focused on technological interoperability and key ethical considerations in regards to those the technologies. So it's not just, for instance, saying, like with algorithmic bias or facial recognition rather, here's how the technology for facial recognition works, and which you'll hear more about later about that project, which is very exciting, as are all the ones today. The logic is, what are the key people and considerations for those things like facial recognition that we have to understand? So sociologists, philosophers, people along with the seminal need to have the engineers and the programmers are in these groups working together to make this stuff work. Anyway, Justin, thank you so much. I hope that's helpful, and really excited for today, and thank you again.
Thank you so much for providing that overview and insight on the initiative and the standards. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Josh, who is going to speak about P7011.
Hi. Yeah, as said, my name is Josh Hyman. You can go and look to our first slide. IND Chair for P7011, long name standard for the process of identifying and rating the trustworthiness of news sites. Just a little bit background about myself. If we go to the next slide, it has my contact information. So I have been working in IT for about 15 years. Just recently, I completed a master's in public policy. As part of the, I guess, capstone of that master's, I was putting together a policy paper, and actually it was the first issue of Ethically Aligned Design that kind of inspired some of my thought processes on this. So I put together a paper discussing how to deal with some of the issues we were seeing in misleading news and information that was being presented to the public. From the most recent presidential election cycle and thereafter. This paper was published in 2017 and presented at IEEE UMCon at the end of 2017. The result of this was the formation of our working group through the IEEE. We are relatively new. We've only been together for just a few months here. But in that time, I think we've really kind of made some significant strides. So if you go to the next slide, just kind of a high level of what our working group is looking to do. So, really this idea is to create a tool for consumers of news and information to help them have a better understanding of the reputation and validity of the information they are consuming through various news outlets. And that, we imagine this as being Twitter, Facebook, Google, Bing, really these portals that users go through to consume news and information, and really providing a tool that can be leveraged within those frameworks that provides some semblance of an understanding of the reputation of where that information is coming from. This is really kind of stemming from the belief that there's a kind of a common refrain that encourages people to do more research before they share, post, click like, or comment on something that they see, to look into the source of who is making that post, to do a fact check on that piece of information. And while those are all great habits to have, the reality of the situation is that that's just not a practical solution for the general public. To expect that kind of effort to be put into every aspect of something that is core to most people's daily lives is considerably onerous. And many people may not even have the wherewithal or skills to perform that kind of research. So the idea behind this is to create an open standard through IEEE by which a reputation can be established for news and information outlets and authors that can then be presented to consumers of information to help them with that process of understanding really where this information is coming from. And this is especially important in this day and age of the increased democratization of news and information. If you want to go to the next slide, please. So just as a high level, again, what we've been discussing about some evaluation criteria and how this standard would approach this. It's looking at factual accuracy where that's possible. This is probably one of the more difficult things to do, but that is certainly a criteria we will want to use. The more automated or more automatable aspects would be things like bias language, and using and developing bias language that is part of the standard. Usage of misleading headlines by doing comparisons of context between headlines of articles and actually content of articles. The utilization and existence of retraction policies. Now this may not lend itself as much to automation, could be a self-reporting feature or even a human driven piece. And it would, of course, apply more to large purveyors of news like a Fox News or a New York Times or CNN or something along those lines. Then a clear distinction between advertisements and content, oftentimes called native content, when it's not even clear to a consumer of information that what they're reading is just a paid advertisement versus actual news reported by some sort of journalistic institution or journalist. And of course, our historical record, going backwards in time to really see what has been put together by this person or organization. Next slide, please. So one of the biggest things that we need within our working group, so we have a very diverse set of skills in our working group so far, and I'm very happy with the makeup we have. And we have myself coming from a public policy standpoint, in IT. We have computer programmers, people that work in AI, automation, journalists, news organizations. We have limited involvement from industry, and industry is really going to be a vital part of this working group and the success of this standard. It's really going to be industry feedback and industry input on how to develop this. It's going to make it usable. What we certainly don't want, this or really any standard to become an academic exercise, and that's why industry involvement is going to be absolutely critical. The idea for the standard is for it to be continually evolving. It is not a standard we release and forget about it. It's a standard that will be released and updated regularly as information technology changes, as word sets, syntaxes, bias sets, networking, networking not as a physical hardware networking, but networking as in the interconnection of sites and information on the internet changes will require continuous updates of the standard. And really the success of that will be driven by industry feedback, adoption, and input. Next slide, please. So where we are currently, we have 6 subgroups that are put together dealing with what we have initially identified as the kind of big factors of the standard and help us kind of divide up what we're looking to do. So scope is the one that we are most actively working on currently, because really once our scope is completely defined, or as close to completely defined as we can achieve at this time, it's really going to help us understand the rest of the aspects we're looking at. And within scope currently are all purveyors of information. Your like I said, New York Times, Fox News, CNN, any of those kind of online presence groups. And we are currently discussing how far to extend that scope to go to an individual blog. Are we more concerned with just the author versus the purveyor? Those are kind of the questions that we're trying to decide, which will help really frame how we approach the standard. And the rest of these, data provenance, how we're dealing with the data that we're consuming and what our approaches are. Trust and identity. I think this is actually something we've have actually had a lot of internal progress on. Some very, I think, novel ideas about how to approach this using blockchain, using fingerprint of authors writing, which is very analogous to maybe some anti-plagiarism software that you may be familiar with, but that can really help with kind of creating a fingerprint for an author, even if he or she changes names between institutions, or you're looking to kind of create an identity and a reputation for an individual. And of course, our criteria for text analysis and publisher analysis, what exactly we would be using to define those reputation ratings. And then of course, analogous systems. We're not an island in this. There's been a lot of interest in other groups. There are, as I mentioned, other tangential solutions out there that do similar things. Like I mentioned, anti-plagiarism software is a very interesting way to approach some of this. So really kind of identifying what these analogous systems are and how we can work with those groups and entities to better leverage a more comprehensive and efficient standard. So our next meeting is probably going to be the second week of August. And of course, we encourage any participation that you may be willing to provide. Show up and listen to what's going on, or feel free to provide us ample feedback. We're really looking for making this as broad and as all-encompassing as we possibly can, because that's what's going to be required to make this successful. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very enlightening for sure. And I cannot echo more that anybody who wishes to join the group or other groups to get involved. And we'll be posting, excuse me, the contact information after the webinar is over. So that way you all can blow up Josh's email. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to David to speak about the P7012.
Hi, sorry, I was muted. Let's see. So everybody can hear me, I assume. So the our working group has not perhaps gotten as far along as the previous one, but we're very excited about it, and it has some history prior to starting up at IEEE, but it seems like IEEE may be a very good home for this activity. The basic idea I'll explain in a second, but late last year when proposals were being entertained, one of the people who have helped start our group, Doc Searles in particular, who along with Joyce Searles has been pursuing a project called Project VRM, and I don't think the initials are supposed to mean anything, but they're supposed to suggest an alternative to what a technology called CRM, which is called Customer Relationship Management, and among those of us who are in the software industry. That kind of idea, customer relationship management, is centered on the seller of a service. And a lot of people working in the privacy field realize that a lot of the issues of privacy center on the individuals whose information is being shared, not so much on the vendors of services. So there was a thought of reversing the, sort of turning the tables, or at least creating a peer-wise structure. So as part of that initiative, which has been going on for several years, and lots of other initiatives that have been going on around that, it became clear that it would, there are some very simple standards compared to the large privacy problem that might help a lot with that effort, and I'll just talk about that in this brief introduction. So if you could go to the first slide. Basically, the purpose of a standard in this area is in the context of a negotiation of an agreement between an individual and another individual, or a company, or any entity that is going to be collecting information and managing information about that individual. And the idea of this standard is to enable the terms of, of the agreement, whatever policy or process the service offers, or, and so forth, to be negotiated fairly from both sides, so that there really is a meeting of minds about what the information, what uses of the information should be allowed, and so forth. We've all heard in the news that, various providers say, it's wonderful, everybody who signs up for our service really wants all the advertising we're going to get. And they say that, and it sounds plausible perhaps, but we don't have any evidence that the individuals who were receiving the advertisements actually wanted their, personal information shared so that the advertising could be targeted at them. That's just one example. So the idea of a standard is basically to enable proffering terms, what you as an individual want done with your information and what you don't want done with your information, and allow those to be processed by machine agents automatically, because obviously it's not going to scale to the scale of network scale without having a large percentage of that activity of just exchanging terms and negotiating terms automated. As I said, the purpose is to basically balance the scales between the, one side and the other. Often one side is thought of as a customer and the other is, thought of as the company, but it need not always be quite that model. And so the basic idea is that a lot of agreements are two-party agreements, and the first party in the agreement and the second party have to come to terms, very much like a contract in common law is negotiated. And in particular, there's been a lot of work in both policy communities and, in various kinds of technology and standards and norms about what are called privacy policies. That is, the documents that are posted on websites and so forth. We're not really focusing on addressing privacy policies at all. Where policies themselves are unilateral, take it or leave it. Terms, on the other hand, are bilateral. So take it to the next slide. So why do we need a standard? I've hinted at that a little bit. The fundamental reason is the internet and the scale of networking that we have today in general, because this can potentially go beyond the internet to almost any kind of network situation. It doesn't come with a notion of privacy defined in it. In fact, the internet scope doesn't even, describe the idea of collections of information. Databases. So we've had databases since the 1970s that are maintained, and there are privacy standards that are associated with databases, medical databases, insurance databases, financial databases that have been around for a long time. But with networking, we have a new opportunity, and the new opportunity is that unlike past business relationships, the internet has encouraged a peer-to-peer kind of style of architecture. And so we have peer-to-peer protocols, and both at low levels like TCP/IP and at higher levels like the World Wide Web family of protocols, HTTP and HTML, and the REST API standards and so forth, and also email standards. And those are really positioned to support two-party agreements and actually support some kind of handshake that might allow for an agreement to be reached fairly simply. I want these terms, you want those terms, we agree on the subset, and we're done. So the norm up to today is that the operators of services proffer policies, as I mentioned before, that are just a list of terms, and they're typically specified in lawyerly language, which to a technology person and a standards person is pretty darn vague and defined in terms of an external context that has nothing to do with information processing systems. And those policies also authorize future changes to be made to those terms and say how they might be made, whether notice is provided or not, etc. And at the end of the day, the individuals who are accepting, wanting to use the service have one choice. They can either accept the policies or not use the service. And in fact, they're not just accepting the policy, they're accepting any future changes to the policy as well. to some extent. So this has been standardized, you know, and it's a well-established body of law and so forth. But we can do better in a peer-to-peer world, and we can do better technologically. The reason why we need a standard is because once you take away the communication problem, and you know everyone's reachable on the internet, every interaction is two-directional, we still don't have any standards for what an agreement might look like, what its terms might look like, and so forth. So the lack of a standard is the last step to getting to a new way of doing business. So given that we can implement fairly intelligent notions of agency, I can have my little wallet, if you will, or some software that runs on my cell phone that basically can read a machine-readable set of terms proffered by a vendor and can tell me which ones I might want to think hard about and which ones I never really, I've already decided I don't care much about. Then those agents can simplify the process. But again, we need some kind of common standard. And if we want to implement this at scale, and you know, the internet now has huge scale, we need standardized machine-readable terms as part of that. So that's what this project is about. We can draw on a lot of history because first of all, there's a lot of legal history about what terms might make sense. There's also a lot of technical history about negotiating various kinds of terms, and there are even projects that are, you know, have either been tried and not worked out so well, or are actively being worked on, but probably won't have the leverage that an IEEE standard would have. So go to the next slide. The real, you know, the crucial thing about a standard is whether it gets adopted. You can have a standard and no one will adopt it, and you know that's a particular problem because it just sits on the shelf. And similarly, you can have a very complex standard and only a very small subset of it gets adopted, for example, as we see in many technical standards. So to really succeed in creating a standard that gets used, you need to focus on the stakeholders. And we really think there are two major stakeholders, the first parties and the second parties. And those are individuals and various kinds of service providers, and also the technologists that provide some context. So, you know, the challenge of a standards group addressing individuals, you know, is hard. One of the things that makes our group somewhat unusual is that we are trying to bring in a variety of entities that are not typically members of IEEE. Hopefully some of them will join IEEE, you know, and participate in some of our working groups. Some of them are people who are in IEEE but have outside interests in privacy stuff. And those, you know, rather than have all the individuals of the world, we hope those people will represent the interests of individuals fairly and accurately as we come to a useful standard. The secondary stakeholders are companies, and industry really should care about this. One reason that they're starting to care is GDPR, which enforces a bunch of principles and rules that are not machine readable and not always clear on entities that hold a lot of personal data. And that's caused a lot of angst, and people, you know, are already seeing the impact of that since it went into effect a couple months ago. But the impact so far has been at the policy level. You get a pop-up that says you agree to the policy, you agree to the fact that we do cookies on our site, and our policy is X. And that's about the amount of automation that's there. Behind the scenes, and a number of us are aware of this, to satisfy the GDPR requirements involves a lot more than that. So for example, in Europe, you now are able to go to a company and say, give me every piece of information you have about me. And you could go to that company even if you haven't agreed to personal information policies. That means that companies have to index and maintain all their data about an individual much more carefully than they used to, and perhaps in a more unified way. And there's a lot of changes going on in that space as well. But the next step after that is figuring out when they introduce a new service, whether they have to get additional agreements from the people that are captured in that data and so forth. So there's a real industry stake here. And, the variety of ways industry can deal with this stake, my personal view coming from industry is that in the end of the day, something like GDPR is going to become the norm, if not the law, in most places. Companies are going to be struggling with whether they can be required to do that, but they're also going to be struggling with the question of how to do it if they, if they're either forced to or their customers really demand that they do that. And then the third part of the stakeholders is what I would call the context people, and the context people are focused on those companies that provide the technology that supports this. Lots of companies hold information, but the information is held or, in websites that contractors, on the cloud, with systems that have features and, and so forth that provide, ways to hold personal information and dispense it and so forth. Those context technology providers, whether they're cloud entities or browser manufacturers or browser vendors, those folks who make browsers are going to be having to provide some kind of hooks for standards like this. And then, so that's one part. The second part is the legal industry, if you will, and the policy world that has to deal with norms and laws around such systems and discuss whether there particular laws should be applied, understand the relationship of the laws to the technology and the standards that are in the system and so forth. So that's basically what we want to have involved in this process, because to get a standard adopted, you really need all affected parties to buy in and be willing to adopt it and use it from day to day. So, for example, there was a closely related idea many years ago, probably to, an idea way too early, called P3P, which was a web standard for stating privacy requirements, if you will, in the HTTP and HTML protocols. It's a elaborated protocol. It was only implemented, as far as I know, by Microsoft's browser, not by the other browsers, and it wasn't widely adopted. Not because people didn't think it was necessarily a good idea, but no one was paying attention to the serious question of adoption and getting all the stakeholders in the same room discussing things. Now, things matter a lot more. It's a much more serious part of our business world, and hopefully, and some of the flaws in P3P, which are potentially technical flaws, can be remedied because there are a lot more eyeballs on the problem. So, if you go to the next slide.
And David, we are going to have, this is Justin, we are going to have to move on to Eric soon, so if you could just please.
That's totally fine. You can look at this slide briefly and get a sense of the desirable properties, and I'm happy to answer questions afterwards. Thanks.
Thank you. So Thank you for the presentation. I mean, I know myself, I had a whole bunch of questions I would have liked, discussions I would have liked to have had about it. But in the interest of time, I'm going to be moving on to Eric in a moment. But I did also want to remind all the participants, please feel free to chat questions to David, and we will do our absolute best to get them there. So, so with that, I'm going to move on to P7013 with Eric.
Hi, everyone. So this is Eric Miller. I'm the Vice Chair of the Working Group for Inclusion and Application Standards for Automated Facial Analysis Technology. So go ahead to the first slide. So I just want to talk about the chair of the working group who started this process, Joy Boilamwini, and she's a graduate student at MIT right now and is sort of leading the charge to bring attention to issues in the accuracy and fairness and appropriateness of the use of face recognition technology, both by governments, by companies, and individuals. So she started this process and recruited me. I'm happy to be a part of it. And you know, one of her major motivations was that as she was doing some work in graduate school and using various off-the-shelf face detectors, she found that they frequently wouldn't see her face at all. They were basically due to the darkness of her skin, and they were, in the applications she was doing, this was perhaps more of a nuisance. But when you start deploying face recognition in other areas like law enforcement and various financial filtering applications and so forth, these gross differences in performance across subgroups can really create serious problems and have serious negative effects. Of course, there are also lots of positive effects. So part of our standard is about you know, laying out the risks and benefits of these new technologies as they're deployed. Next slide. Just tell you a little bit about myself. I believe one of the earlier slides said I was a professor at MIT. If they have a job for me, I'll definitely consider it. But right now, I'm at UMass Amherst, and which is also a great computer science school. And my research interests are in computer vision and machine learning and statistics. I've been working in face recognition since about 2005. In areas like detection, verification, recognition, and alignment. And one of the reasons I've also done quite a bit of work in publishing data sets and databases for face recognition, such as the Labeled Face in the Wild, which is probably the most widely used database for testing face recognition algorithms right now. And also we published at UMass the Face Detection Database and Benchmark, which is a benchmark for face detection. And issues of how you build your databases and benchmarks are, of course, important when you're trying to develop standards for evaluating face recognition technology. Next slide. So our goal really is to produce a playbook for decision makers who are considering adopting facial analysis technology. And just some examples of this, by no means exclusive, would be face recognition for policing, expression recognition for hiring, face verification for access to mobile devices like you see on an iPhone 10, or to financial services like acting as a password to your bank account, face detection and tracking for consumer apps, and facial attribute classification for insurance quotes. And all of these applications are either already deployed or in consideration for deployment now. And of course, there are many others as well. Next slide. So, of course, as everyone knows, face recognition and face analysis technology is being more and more widely deployed across all kinds of different sectors, and there growing concerns about potentially unlawful use of face detection or unregulated use, where, say, for example, there's a website called Big Brother Watch in the UK, where they report on various deployments by police in the UK, in which large numbers of people are under surveillance, basically with automatic face recognition algorithms, and people, even if they're misrecognized, maybe put in face databases that were originally created for felons or criminals and so forth. So there are many issues there. There's another website by the Georgetown Law School called the Perpetual Lineup Report that discusses similar issues. And various researchers, like the chair of our working group, Joy, and her co-author, have done studies showing that subgroups the recognition of standard off-the-shelf technology is often significantly worse for some subgroups than others. So, for example, if you're trying to identify the gender of a subject, they found that the accuracy rates were much, much lower for people with dark skin than for light skin, and recognition rates and so forth have been shown to be lower for various subgroups, possibly based on how the algorithms were trained or other aspects. So those are important issues that are coming up more and more, and we want to try to address those and make recommendations to people who are trying to evaluate their own software, and also create open standards so that people whose faces are being recognized can evaluate the technology and understand what to expect from it. Next slide. So just a couple examples of how widespread the technology is becoming. 130 million U.S. adults are indexed in various law enforcement databases, and really there's very little regulation currently about how these faces are used, who can be stored, and what sort of what kind of accuracy the algorithms have that that are being used on these databases and used to match people with these databases. Next slide. This is an example from the Big Brother Watch webpage, in which they did a study on a deployment by the South Wales Police Force in the UK, and they determined that 91% of the matches reported by the system were incorrect and wrongly identified innocent people as matching with criminals in a database. And subsequently, more than 2,400 people, innocent people's photos were taken and stored in the database for subsequent matching. So, we're not necessarily trying to define the rules at the moment, but we want to promote transparency and establish standards for the way these kinds of technologies are being used. Next slide. So we want to choose 3 particular scenarios for study in our standard. It's very early in our work on the standard, so all of this is subject to change, but we're looking at having 3 possible standards for analysis: 1 in law enforcement, 1 in consumer products, and 1 in business operations, such as like whether somebody's face can be automatically analyzed to determine whether they should receive a loan or not. We really want to provide clear discussions of the risks and benefits of using the technology in ways that have been, well established, but also other aspects that are perhaps more speculative. Next slide. And, for those who haven't been reading or thinking about this a lot, this is just a collection of some of the things that can happen believe it or not, there are people out there who are publishing scientific papers that say they can tell your IQ just by looking at your face. These are somewhat controversial papers, and you can imagine that if these things are used, they could be used by an insurance company to decide what your premium should be, and things like this. So I think it's obvious that there are serious potential downsides of this technology being misused. And so we want to identify these possible individual harms or collective social harms, and identify them and establish guidelines for how this technology should be used. Next slide. So just a summary of where we are right now. Once again, Joy Bwalamwini is our chair and the leader of this effort, and I've joined her recently. She was sorry she couldn't be here today. She's on a transatlantic flight as we speak, but we're looking for additional participation. We've got a pending call for participation, and we have we really want to get strong industry participation, of course, and we've got verbal commitments from many tech companies, as you can see here, and also people from the Georgetown Law Center for Technology and Privacy. So that's what I have today, and thanks for inviting me to participate in this.
Thank you, Eric. I really appreciate your presentation, and I did have one quick follow-up question for you. Given that we have not yet approached 50% of the world's population being connected to the internet, and that typically, the data that is used to fuel these technologies are from, shall we say, industrialized countries for the most part. How is that going to impact and affect those who have not yet come online, who may be from different areas of the world and have different values?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, I didn't put in any details of more specific issues we're considering for the standard, but some of the things that are very important to us are things like the intended use of a particular face recognition technology. So for example, if I've trained my face recognizer with a database of Caucasians and then I deploy it in Beijing for access control in an office building in Beijing, it may not work very well. And so one of the things we want to do is establish, very much like the pharmaceutical industry, we want to establish a notion of intended uses and indications and contraindications for a given software product. So if your product has been tested on certain populations and shown to achieve a certain level of accuracy on those populations, then it would be I don't want to say approved for use, but satisfactory for use within those populations. But if you took it to a completely different population for which it had not been evaluated, it's really not ready for deployment there, or at least if you deploy it there, you can't really claim to have to be able to predict its performance in those situations. So I'm a big fan of trying to define intended use and specific things that something is not for. Another example would be, so the database I developed labeled Face in the Wild has virtually no children in it, and the reason for that are sort of a long story, but obviously if you train a face recognizer on our database, you would not necessarily expect it to work terribly well in recognizing children. And so people understand these things in the technological world, but that doesn't mean that there are standards for describing the intended use of your software and so forth. So, so if you go to a place that hasn't had such technology deployed before, you really need to look at the population of interest. Are people wearing, wearing something on their heads, whether it's turbans or headscarves or something that's going to completely change the way an algorithm works in a particular scenario. And so our emphasis is really going to be on openness and clarity, rather than necessarily trying to define rigid rules up front. But yeah, so I'll pause there. I think that's part of the answer to your question.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. And in interest of time, I'm going to have to move on. And I do have a question for David. One of the items you were discussing is that you feel that, for example, GDPR type legislation is going to become pervasive, and in that aspect, we have had some laws passed or under consideration here in the United States, such as the California Consumer Privacy Act. And I was wondering how you think those types of laws affect your work in this space.
Actually, this is a good opportunity if you on the call and can talk, for Doc Searles to answer a question. Doc is also in our group.
Hi. Yeah. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good. Yeah. I'm sitting at a Starbucks in Eugene, Oregon, and there's traffic going by, so I'm writing mute. What the main effect of the GDPR, of e-privacy in Europe, and now the impending legislation and regulation in California is really to awaken those operating the servers in the world that David described well earlier to new possibilities. I mean, what we're proposing here and what we're working on here, I think, can really provide GDPR compliance and compliance with a lot of these other regulations. Almost always with the development of these regulations, the assumption is that all agency lives on the server side. But fortunately, say in the case of the GDPR, it defines a data controller as a natural person, as well as, or it can be a natural person as well as a machine, and machines can represent either party. But we've been working on this, but by we I mean my wife Joyce and I, and Project VRM, which David mentioned earlier, which has been at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard since 2006. We've been gathering developers around developing tools that make individuals online both independent but better able to engage for a long time. Ad blockers, tracking protection, and some other tools are examples of that. We've worked with browser makers, especially Mozilla, on approaches to this. But it really hasn't been until the threat of the GDPR, now the GDPR being enforced, though it hasn't really been enforced yet. It's been enforced, but not enforced. It came into effect in May 25th of this year. It hasn't been until that it's really upset the apple cart for the companies, operating servers out there. And their first response has been to produce these really annoying cookie notices that don't even make distinctions between cookies that are friendly and first party on their part, where it's for the site's own purposes, which were the original purpose of cookies as they were designed by Lou Montulli at Netscape in 1994, where all they do is remember state and sort of help you out on the user side. And the third-party cookies that are busy spying on you. These are very, very different things. It's sort of the difference between keys in your pocket and ordnance you can step on that blows up. I mean, it's really a vast difference, and that difference is blurred in the way these cookie notices are deployed. So I think that we're really very advantaged right now by the regulation coming along. But I think it's important to mention as well that we have that legislation and regulation in the absence of tech on our side, and that was really an oversight and a mistake on the technology developers' part. But we can remedy that now, and it really will help to have standards that, for example, the browser makers, as David mentioned earlier, can deploy. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate your
Welcome.
we did, I know we're running very close on time, so I'm going to read a question we received from the audience, from Bill Radcliffe. And the question is, are you considering the relationships / impact of one working group to another? For example, P7011 and P7013. And I'm not sure, maybe which one of you would like to take that one? So item, and maybe even we do have John Havens on the line as well, who maybe may want to take a stab at that question.
Well, I'm sure whenever we've discovered that there's overlap between our projects, we do try to work together. We do have coordinators within the 7000 series that do help us make sure we're talking to each other. I think at this time that there's not enough overlap between 11 and 13 that we need to consider combining or anything like that. But of course, all our resources could be shared if they need to be. And again, the 7000 series does have oversight as far as management to kind of make sure that we're all, if there is opportunity for us to work with each other, that we're identifying that and leveraging it as best we can.
Thank you. And with that, we are at the top of the hour, and so what I'd like to do is thank all of the panelists for speaking. And your information was very insightful, and it's fascinating to learn more about these projects. And I'd also like to thank the audience for participating, asking questions, and it's appreciated.